With us is Marc Fisher, who is the senior editor of the Washington Post. He reports and writes on a wide range of topics, including having served as their enterprise editor for 2 years, blogging for them. He wrote a book called Something in the Air, Radio Rock and the Revolution That Shaped a Generation. We'll have to talk about that some point too, Marc. But Marc is here to talk to us about his reporting on debt collection and Social Security. Marc, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Listen, you wrote a story that got a lot of attention and a little bit of action too. I would say quite a bit of results. Can you tell us a little bit about your story on the debt collection in
Sure.
Social Security?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a story that developed when I got a tip about people who had their tax refunds confiscated by the U.S. government. These are people who filed their taxes a little bit early this year. They were expecting their refund in the mail, and instead they get a letter from the government, from Treasury Department, saying that they have intercepted your tax refund to pay off an old debt. Now, in every case that I ended up speaking to dozens of people who have had this experience, and it turns out that Social Security had overpaid a lot of folks over the years, often small amounts, sometimes a few $100s, sometimes a few thousand, and now, because of a change, a one-sentence change in the law, lifting the statute of limitations, they could go after these really old debts. So these people who had their tax refunds taken never knew they had these debts. In fact, in many cases, the debts belong not to them, but to their parents, who have long since died. And the government is now coming after the kids of these deceased people and trying to get repayment of debts that no one in the family ever knew existed.
So you have a situation here where, for example, I might be counting on a tax refund to, fix something in the house or just get by, and all of a sudden it's taken from me, and they're saying because literally in 1961 they believe they overpaid one of my parents or some other family member. Now I'm not getting. Now they're penalizing me 2,500 or whatever the amount might be, and I
Right.
have essentially, if I understand your story correctly, in these situations I would have had no recourse,
Yeah, not
nothing I
only
can do.
you have no recourse, you have no notice. The government is required to give you notice of a debt before they take your money, either by confiscating your tax refund or maybe garnishing your wages. But in many of these cases, the way the government went about sending out notice was to send a letter to the address of the family 40 years ago. And so those bounced back, of course, because not a lot of people live where their parents lived 40 years ago. And so these folks never got any notice until their tax refund was taken from them. And there's very little recourse here. There is an appeals process, but the government makes the decision, and they choose to decide on the government's behalf 90% of the time. So these folks were out a lot of money in some cases, and all told, Social Security went after 400,000 of these old debts to the tune of about $700 million just in the last year or so. So this is a pretty widespread phenomenon, or was until our story was published, and 4 days later we got the government to roll this back.
That was the impressive thing, is that you got an immediate response from the government that they would stop doing this, which is, I have to say, very impressive. And I also have to say, if a notice were sent to the house where I was born, nobody would get it because it's a Rust Belt city. The house is abandoned. Maybe the crack dealers next door would notice it. But basically, I can tell you, a lot of people are in the same situation. So here, you have a story where, in effect, it would unite left and right across the political spectrum. People would be outraged at this sort of unilateral exercise of unjust power. And how did you find out that you had actually gotten results on this? How did you find out that as a result of your story, they were going to stop handling these cases this way?
Well, in the aftermath of the first story, I heard from many hundreds of people who'd been similarly affected, and they wanted to know what recourse there was, and there wasn't much I could tell them. The couple of lawyers who've handled some of these cases really didn't want to do any more because they tend to be for very small amounts of money. It's not worth their time to fight Social Security, which would take a lot of hours, and so I ended up referring some of them to their members of Congress. and some congressmen made some inquiries and urged the government to stop this practice. And apparently there was some pressure from on high, because on Monday of this week, the acting commissioner of Social Security put out a statement saying that they would no longer attempt to collect these debts of more than 10 years delinquency. Now, that does not help the people whose tax refunds have already been confiscated. There's no move as yet to restore their money, but that's something that a lot of these folks are asking the government to do, and it may yet happen. We shall see.
Now, let me ask you about that. So, actually, let me ask you a different question, because it's been on my mind since I read your initial story, which is, were you able to get any kind of glimpse into the psychology of the kind of human being who would actually initiate a policy like this? I mean, I think that, whether we have a liberal government in power or a conservative government, did you get a sense of how bureaucrats, for lack of a better word, can justify doing this kind of thing to themselves, in their own minds?
Yeah,
Did you get a glimpse of the psychology?
It's a great question, and that was my central curiosity as well. So I first tried to figure out who exactly was behind this. And what happened was I stumbled into a festival of finger-pointing in which the Social Security folks said, well, Treasury must have come up with this, and I went to Treasury, and they said, no, this had to have come from Congress. I went to Congress, and they pointed their fingers back at Treasury. So we still haven't found the exact person who initiated it, but it does look like it came from Treasury. Here's how it all developed. There was one line that was inserted into the Farm Bill back in 2008 that said the government could henceforth go after all of these old debts, these more than 10-year-old debts, which previously had been barred by law. Now, it then took Treasury 2 or 3 years to write the regulations that would allow them to go about doing just that. And in that process, we spanned both the Bush and Obama administrations. So the law was changed by the Bush administration, and the regulations enforcing the new law were written by the Obama administration. So this is not a partisan issue. This is not a liberal or conservative issue. This grew out of the idea that the government was leaving a lot of money on the table, that there were billions of dollars that Americans owed the government, and as part of making the government more efficient and part of trying to help with the deficit issue, the government should be more rigorous about collecting its debts. Well, that, I think everybody's on board with that. No one wants the government to let people slide. The issue here is, do you then go after children of people who owe the debts, which in the rest of American law is simply forbidden? I mean, even on the Federal Trade Commission's own website, it says children may not be held accountable for their parents' debts. So, to your question, how do they justify this? They say that the kids who, let's say your family was getting survivor's benefits because a parent died, they say that the kids, even though they didn't directly receive those benefit payments, were getting the benefit of the money, and that they were being fed and clothed with those benefit dollars, and therefore they should be responsible for repaying any overpayments now.
I don't know. There's something kind of Soviet about it. But if you're telling me that that I can really blame Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner for all of this, I'm back in my comfort zone.
Yeah. Well, it is, as you said, an act of the bureaucracy, and somewhere in the Treasury Offset Program, which is the area of the department that handles these kinds of cases, they decided that the only way to get money that was owed by people who'd long since died was to go after their kids. And so they came up with these regulations, and no one probably thought to the question of, how would this hit those people, and how would they feel about being done for debts that they never knew existed, and that the government can't prove. I mean, this is one of the things that most outrages people, is that the government is unable to come up with documents showing how that debt came about in the first place. And how do you fight a case when the government won't tell you what it's all about to begin with?
Yeah, that's the Kafkaesque piece of all of this, and it sounds like the that Kafkaesque nightmare isn't over for the people that you've gotten action in terms of ending this practice going forward. But you mentioned the people who've already had their tax refunds taken or other benefits taken. Now, where do they stand? Do they have any hope of appeal? Is there any follow up underway about that?
Yeah, we're posing questions about it because I've heard from a number of people around the country in the last couple of days who had their tax refunds taken that when they now call and appeal again and say, look, the government has changed its policy, you're not collecting these debts anymore, therefore it seems only fair that you would go ahead and restore our tax refunds that have been taken from us. And so they are getting a kind of equivocal answer at this point in which the Social Security Administration says, well, we're looking into it, or, well, we're considering it. So it does seem as if there may be something afoot that would perhaps restore this money to these folks.
Well, in the 30 seconds we have left, one final question. I am assuming it felt pretty good for you to get some results on this.
Yeah, it's terrific. I mean, it's often you shine light on difficult situations, and either nothing happens or things get more complicated. This was a usually clean win for the people who are affected by this.
Well, I have to say I envy you that, and it's great work, and I'm glad you're staying on the case. Marc Fisher, senior editor of the Washington Post. Thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.